All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and we've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for Murox ASP.NET 4.6 with C# 2015 6th edition textbook. I'm up to Chapter 8 of 25, so I'm right in the middle of Part 2 of the book, or Section 2. And this chapter, as you can see, is entitled How to Work with State Cookies and URL Encoding. Now, virtually every kind of programming language that does client-server interaction works directly or indirectly, with what's referred to as session or state, or session state. But it's the idea that as you go from page to page in a website, you want to be able to pass information and retain information as you go from page to page. There are different ways that you can do that. And a discussion of these is what this chapter is mainly all about. So, our objectives, notice we've got 2 pages as usual. Given the specifications for an application that requires the use of state cookies or URL encoding, be able to develop that kind of an application. Our knowledge objectives: describe the use of viewState. Describe the way session state works, focusing on the session state object and the session ID. Describe the events typically used to trigger event handlers and save session state items. Describe the use of the cookieless attribute for the session state element in the web.config file. Describe the use of application state and caching. Distinguish between an application state object and a cache object. Explain how the global.asax file is used for an application with application state. Describe the use of cookies, including session cookies and persistent cookies. And finally, describe the use of URL encoding. When I do these chapters, I kind of, for lack of better words, do them off the top of my head. So I'm not sure with this how many, if any, actual code examples we're going to have, or if we're just going to go through the PowerPoints. So we'll see as we go. So first they start by talking about viewState. And again, the idea is what I just mentioned to you previously. Notice it says we want to be able to retain values of a web page and properties that change from one execution of a page to another. So in a kind of the quintessential example of this, for lack of better words, for most people, is the use of something like a online store. All right, so some kind of an e-commerce application where you are able to put things into a shopping cart, go back, do more shopping, put more things into a shopping cart, go back, maybe modify, add more, remove something from a shopping cart, but eventually be able to check out. And the idea is as you go from an order page to a checkout page, for example, that you're able to retain those values. And that's what's really important about this. Now notice, before ASP.NET sends a page back to the client, it determines what changes the program has made to the properties of the page and its controls. Now, one thing we may or may not have talked about a lot in here, but I do want to mention it to you, and that is the fact that as ASP.NET goes through its life cycle, and I probably should even just show you that. There are a lot of different things about that, but let's type in here ASP.NET life cycle. All right. And this is from Microsoft, which is always a good place to go for this stuff. So it says the general life cycle stages are shown right here. Cut it down. I'd like to put it all on one page if I can. Well, I'm going the wrong way here. There we go. So what do we have? We've got a page request. As it says, this occurs before the page lifecycle begins. When the page is requested by the user, ASP.NET determines whether the page needs to be parsed and compiled, or whether there's already a version maybe in memory that could be sent. Okay? Then it goes to start. As it says in the start stage, Page properties like the HTTP request and the HTTP response are basically set. At this stage, the page determines whether the request is a postback or a new request. So is it an existing request or a new request? Initialization. During page initialization, controls on the page are available, and each control's unique ID property is set. A master page, and we're going to talk about master pages in the next chapter, but a master page and themes are also applied to the page if applicable. So far we haven't been working really with master pages, but we will look at them starting in the next chapter. If the current request is a postback, the postback data has not yet been loaded and control property values have not been restored to the values from view state. Load. During the load state, if the current request is a postback, the control properties are loaded with information recovered from view state and control state. Postback event handling. If the event is a postback, the control event handlers are called. After that, the validate method of the validator controls are called, which sets the isValid property. We saw that in the last chapter. Then rendering. Before rendering, view state is saved for the page and all of its controls. During the rendering stage, the page calls the render method for each control, providing, etc. Finally, unload. The unload event is raised after the page has been fully rendered and sent to the client. So they go through that. That is the life cycle stages, and the life cycle stages are filled with events. Pre-init, init complete, preload, load. There are control events, load complete, pre-render complete, etc. The bottom line is, when you're going through this stuff, there is just a boatload of stuff that's going on behind the scenes. All right? And with this boatload of stuff that's going on behind the scenes, if you do desire, you can add code to one or more of those events that I just mentioned. So before ASP.NET sends a page back to the client, it determines what changes the program has made to the properties of the page and its controls. These changes are encoded in this hidden input field that's known as _viewState. We saw that before. In fact, if I go to the last example that I've been going over there with you, stop the run, of course. I guess I'll have to run it. I'm wrong there. So let's run it, and let's just not put anything in. But if I right mouse click here and view page source, again, as we look through here, there's our view state. Right there. So that's what they're talking about. Now that's going to look different. So remember this. In fact, I'll keep this one up there. Okay? I'll keep that one up there. And then I'll go back to our program, stop the run it again, and this time let's fill in something for every field. And I really should have made this a password field, all right, instead of making it just a straight text box. No, that's too small. Remember, it said it had to be at least $50,000. All right, so now we've got all that information. We click submit. Boom, all that information is in there. I'm going to view the page source again. All right, why am I doing that? Well, if we look here, and I want to show you this. In fact, let's grab that whole line and copy it. I'm going to throw it into Notepad++ here. All right, so this will be the old one. And this one we just did, that will be the new one. All right, so that's all of that stuff. So ID equals this, value equals this big mess here. All right. Now, I want to go back and grab the original one that I had, which is in this mess someplace. don't know if this is the original one or the other one, but that's okay. We'll figure it out. This looks like it's the one I already had in there, so that's the new one, so that's fine. Let's go back. We'll find the old one, I promise. All right. There's the view source. Looking for my other view source. I should have been able to retain that. That's the new one. So let's go back. I'll tell you what, let's do this. We'll go back. We'll stop the run. We'll run it again. We'll put nothing in here. All right. We'll submit. We get all our errors. Let's view the page source. Let's go down to this line. And let's go copy that in. All right, you notice that these are quite a bit different. What the system has done in both cases is it is, for lack of better words, kind of encrypted all of the information that we put into that form, and it's put it into the view state variables. So that information is available if we have to go and reference that information again. So when the page is posted back to the server, the view state field is sent back to the server along with the HTTP request. ASP.NET retrieves the property values from view state and uses them to restore the page and the control properties. It also uses view state to save the values of the page properties it uses, such as postback. Now, I'm going to be honest with you here. For this to make sense, you're going to have to read the chapter and go through the examples. I feel no pity for a person who says, I don't get this. And if I say, did you look at the chat? Did you read the chapter? No, I didn't have time. Then make time. Because this is amongst the hardest stuff that's in the book. 8 and 9 are very difficult chapters. I'm not saying there aren't other difficult chapters in the book. By and large, I think these 2 chapters are harder than the first 7 that we've already gone over. So, view state is not used to restore data entered by a user into a text box or any other input control unless the control responds to different change events. If view state is enabled for a data-bound control, and it's databases basically, the control will not be bound again when the page is reposted. Rather, the values will be restored from the view state. So, maybe you don't want to use view state. Why might you not want to use view state? Well, they give you 2 examples here when you might not want to. Number 1, when restoring the control properties for a page, affects the way you want the form to work. You may disable view state for 1 or more controls. When the size of the view state gets so large that it affects performance, you may want to disable view state. When you disable view state, you can do it in 3 ways, as are shown on the slide here. You can turn it off just for a control. So for that control, you set their enable view state property to false. So for instance, and let's see, I may be wrong or I may be right here with what I'm about to show you, but that's okay. Here was that validation summary. And you notice there's an enable view state that's set to true. We could just double click on that property, which toggles it, or we could go down here and choose false. Either way. Or we could set it to false here, or we could set it to false in code. So that's one way we can do that. We can do it for an entire page. Remember, at the top of each one of our pages, so at the top of each one of our .aspx files, we have what's called the ASP page directive. We haven't talked very much about this, but there's the language we're using. It says we're automatically going to wire things up. That's our code behind file, and that's where it inherits from. So there is another thing that we can put in here that's for view state. And I may not be putting it in correctly, but if we set that equal to false, all right, that will disable view state for the entire page. Now, do you want to do that? Well, again, as the author just went over, you may want to do it if it gets to be so large, the view state, that it's slowing down performance. Look at it this way, all right? Imagine that I'm taking a trip around the world, all right? And every time I stop, I am writing what I did for that day I'm writing a very detailed entry of what I did for that day in an electronic journal. All right? And as time goes on, I'm going to more and more interesting places. So I'm stopping more and more. So I'm writing more and more in my electronic log, blog, whatever it happens to be. And eventually it gets so big that, let's say it's my website, that it's slowing down. When people are going to my website, there's so much information in it and pictures and whatever that I start to remove some of the stuff from it. The same idea takes place here. I can also go into that web.config file. We've looked at that a little bit, but the web.config file, which is shown in here, it's always the bottom file. All right, I can turn off view state in there as well. So look at it this way, okay? And if this confuses you, if you do it for a control, let's put this in the guise of like CSS, okay? Disabling view state for a control is like using a span tag in CSS, where you might want to make a word bigger or a sentence bigger or a paragraph or a letter in a, like I've given the once upon a time example. That's disabling view state for a control. Disabling view state for an entire page is like writing style tags for just an individual page in CSS, but having the inline CSS right in there, the internal. Disabling it for the entire application is like having an external CSS file that you use for every page of the website. All right, hopefully that helped a little bit. If you want to enable the view state, so maybe you've turned it off, but you want to turn it back on just for a few controls, you can do that too, and I'll let you look at that yourselves. How to determine the size of the view state for a page. All right, it says enable the trace feature. Remember you set trace equal to true. We looked at that back in Chapter 5. Then you go down and you start taking a look at what's in there. All right. All that information that I just gave you, the last several slides were the information from pages 278 and 279 in the chapter, in Chapter 8. So, although view state was designed to automatically save page and control property values across round trips to the browser, you can also add your own data to view state. When you want to add your own data to the view state, you store it in a view state object that's created from what's called the state bag class. The common members of this state bag class are shown on your screen right now. There is name, and this is from 280 and 281 in your book. The name is the value of the view state item. If you set the value of an item that doesn't exist, then it's created. You've got count, which is the number of items in your view state collection. Keys. This is all done as a key value pair. All right, so you've seen this kind of thing when you've got a query string where it says like name equal Jeff. All right, name is the key, value is Jeff. It's the same kind of thing in here, where the keys are a collection of keys for all items in the view state collection, and values are a collection of all the values. So those are the properties, count, keys, and values. The methods, there's add, to add an item to a view state collection. If that item already exists, it's updated. There's clear, which removes all items from a view state collection, and remove, which removes just the specified item. These are very similar to like when you use a list box and you've got the items class that you work with, where you've got add, clear, and remove. They're very similar in nature. So they show you some examples. Here's a statement that allows you to add a view state item, or if that view state item called timestamp exists, update it to the current time. Here's another way you can do it. Here is doing it more an object-oriented way. Here is doing it more an array-looking type of way. So to access the view state object for a page, you use the view state property. Usually you use session state and not view state to save this information. So again, this slide and this slide here are all showing examples that are on page 280 and 281. So that was view state. So let's talk a little bit about session state. ASP.NET uses session state to track the state of each user of an application. It creates a session state object that has a unique session ID, which is typically around 30 or 40 characters in length. This ID gets passed to the browser, then back to the server with the next request. That way, the server can identify the user, so to speak, that this is related to. Because session state sends only the session ID to the browser, it doesn't slow response time, but it can slow performance on the server side. To work with data in session state, you use this HTTP session state class that you see right here. Common member, name, which is the value of the session state item with a specified name. If you set one that doesn't exist, then it's created. Session ID, the two common properties, which is the unique ID of the session. Count, which is the number of items in the session state collection. The three common methods. Add, which adds an item to the session state collection, or if it already exists, updates that item. Clear, which removes all items. And remove, which removes the specified item. So you'll notice these are virtually the same as these, but the state bag is used with view state, whereas the HTTP session state is used with session state. So they have some code examples here. And this is taken from page 283 in the textbook. And again, they're using more this way of doing things, which is more the way of using like an array. So session, email, equals email. That's either going to create a new session variable called email and copy the value of email into it, or if there is an existing session variable named email, it'll take that current value of this email and copy it into it. So that's putting the session variable on the left-hand side of the equal sign. When it's on the right-hand side of the equal sign, you're grabbing it and you can copy it into a variable. And then they show you a remove and a retrieve. Page events that can be used to get and save session state data. This is shown in the textbook on page 284 and 285. The load, which is done in page load, as it mentions here on 285. This event occurs when a page is requested from the server after all controls have been initialized and the view state has been restored. You use this to test whether the session state object already exists, or to get data from it if it does exist, and to create data or to create a session object if it does not exist. Pre-render, which the handler name is page pre-render, occurs after the control events for the page have been processed, but before the HTML has been sent back from the server to the browser. You can use this to update the value type variables in the object, but you don't need to do that for reference type variables. So again, they show you some code examples here. Here's an example from page 285 of a load event handler that gets the session state object named cart. Here's another example that updates a cart object. And here's another example that updates the value in the cart update object. You only need to update a session state item explicitly like this if it's stored in a value type variable, like an integer. If it's stored in a reference type of variable, like a custom object, the session state will be updated when the variable is updated. That's because the variable is actually a pointer to what's being updated. So rather than that variable, that object variable holding the value, it holds the address in memory where that value is. Let me check my time here. All right, I'm at 26 minutes, so I believe that right now I'm going to stop and come back with part 2 of this presentation in just a couple minutes.